Well, conservative Supreme Court justices were pretty hostile on Monday as they debated affirmative action, whether or not to use race-based affirmative action in college admissions. And here to discuss that and where we are just days away from the election is Reverend Al Sharpton. Rev, I was so excited to have you on today because there's so much I kind of wanted to get into and really be on the record. And we saw yesterday and watched as the justices battled over this issue of affirmative action. What were some of the takeaways that you had from this?
Well, there were several things that came to mind, Ebony, and none of which were good to me. One is that when affirmative action started, it was created under the Nixon administration in the early 70s by a Black deputy labor secretary named Arthur Fletcher. And the idea was the only way that we were able to have Blacks catch up, because Blacks were not voluntarily behind. By law, we couldn't go to certain schools, we couldn't live in certain neighborhoods, we couldn't have certain jobs. So the government had to undo what the government did. I mean, I think what's lost in this argument is asking, why is the government asking to lift these people up? Because the government helped put us down. And the government needs to have a program that goes against their program of 246 years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow. These were all government-sanctioned laws. They had this where race would be a factor, and we'd have certain goals to have a certain amount of people that were Black, African American, admitted to college. Then the Supreme Court came back years later and said, well, race can be a factor. It should not be the factor. It should be race, it should be income, it should be several things. Now they're talking about taking race out altogether. It shouldn't be a factor at all. The danger of that is when they had these state initiatives to end race in affirmative action, like in California, it went down to a 2/3 less Blacks admitted. The real danger of this is not only, Ebony, will it end the high numbers that we are starting to see of Blacks in the school. They will then use it to say if race should not be a factor for education, it shouldn't be a factor for contract in the private sector. It should be a factor for board seats in the private sector. It should be a factor for jobs. It could wipe out diversity programs, because really what they're doing is it starts here, but they're really making the consideration of racial discrimination unconstitutional. And that's frightening. The last part of that is, as we see these oral arguments, the week before midterm election, all of our community members that ran around in 2016 talking about voting doesn't matter, and I don't want to, Hillary ain't perfect, and I don't like this and other. You were the reason that we have a 6-3 conservative court, because Donald Trump won, because a lot of us cynically didn't vote in 2016. And he was able to put 3 judges on the bench, and they will decide the fate of the legality and constitutionality of race in this country.
Some of what you're saying also piggybacks off of what we heard, even though she had to excuse herself from this. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who said during this, she said she's worried, almost like what you said before, that this creates an unequal system. And she was strong and doubled down on that. And one thing that did stick out that we've heard play over and over again is when the question of diversity came up, and we hear Justice Thomas say that he doesn't understand diversity. What is diversity? And he's still trying to understand that. That struck a chord in me when he said that. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
I mean, if it struck a chord in you, it struck all chords in you. Because let's not forget that Justice Thomas used to head EEOC. So if he doesn't understand diversity, then what did he understand when he was in charge of economic opportunities?
And as a product of affirmative action.
That's a direct product of affirmative action. So he understood it then. What is he confused about now? And I think that one of the saddest things that I've seen in my journey is to see a guy from our community, grew up in segregated Georgia, sit up on that bench and use every effort he can to try and kick the ladder that he climbed for nobody else to climb. It's just an act of clear betrayal.
Rev, as we get closer to the midterms and just days away, we're talking about affirmative action. We're talking about voting rights. In my mind, I have to say, not how did we get there from a standpoint of how nasty this political game has become, but is there something within the movement that did not change, that should have changed, whether it be the tactics that we use, can we look at even how the movement has been led from the civil rights on? Is there something that we can double down and glean on to say where there are tactics that weren't used? How did we get here from that standpoint?
I think that the problem was not the tactics. I think the problem was that we turned on each other and not continued to use the tactics. So the difference is that the tactics that we were using when I was a kid in the civil rights movement got us from when in 1972, when I was youth director for Shirley Chisholm's campaign for president, it got us from there to 2008, where we elected a Black president. It worked. But then some got in position and turned on those tactics, like a Clarence Thomas, and others that didn't go as far as Thomas, but they would not continue the movement. They would not participate in what we were doing to continue that, and became governors and senators and congresspeople and mayors, and abandoned the movement that sponsored them. So I don't think it was the movement. I think it was some of those that enjoyed the fruits of the movement that did not reinvest in the movement that sponsored it. So they became mayor, they became congressperson, and guys like me became controversial, even to them, when it was all right what we were doing to get you there. But once you're there, well, I don't know if I could give advertising to Black media. I don't know if I could deal with Black radio. I need a more white staff. And I think it was almost biblical, Ebony. It's like when the children of Israel got out of bondage, rather than turning on Pharaoh, they turned on Moses. And I think that is what stopped many of us. Don't forget the movements of late, from Trayvon to George Floyd, were not led by the people that are in office or in power or that made a lot of money. It was the same people that fought to get them there. And I think that, I'm not saying everybody should be a civil rights leader or everybody should be an activist, but they should have at least supported. And when we could not get that support, the other side got nothing but support. So the right wing, they support Fox News, and they support right-wing radio. They support their civic leaders. In our community, where we're on right now, does not get the same kind of support they should have got from the Black corporate executives that should have made sure those budgets invested in our keeping our voice. So they turned us into where we had to deal with less and try to.
Just a couple more questions when it comes to the elections. What states are you looking at that maybe kind of have you on edge? We're seeing the tight race that's happening in Georgia. Some are looking at what's happening in Philly and in Arizona. What states do you have top of mind now?
I've been to Georgia twice in the last 3 weeks, and I've been to Pennsylvania this last weekend. I'm very concerned about both of those states. I'm concerned about Florida, because I think that if the DNC had put more money in, Val Deming would have a chance of winning. And I'm very concerned about Arizona. I'll be watching to see if Pennsylvania, Georgia, or Arizona changes one way or another that night. If we see the Democrats lose any one of them, they're going to have to pick up the other two of the three. And that is a very nervous night. Let's put it that way.
Very extremely. Lastly, we're seeing more and more polls, even recently, say that people are scared to come out to the polls. Scared to come out to the polls, not wanting to even participate and work as election workers because of the violence that we're seeing. Good thing that we have seen a lot of early voting, but we've even seen people stalked on their way to turning in their ballots. What's your sentiment as we get closer to the election, and what is your word for people who are like, I normally do, but I'm scared to even come out of my house?
The sentiment is real. When you see armed people standing near drop boxes in Arizona, they want to intimidate. And what I say to people that are afraid is they would not be using scare tactics if they were not afraid that we were going to let people that would put people like them where they belong, and that is in some cases behind bars, and in other cases they'd be afraid to come out and intimidate. And I remind them that there was not a morning that America woke up and said, let's be nice to Negroes and gave us the right to vote. People fought through worse intimidation than this to give us the right to vote. Goodman, Cheney, Swerner, Medgar Evers got killed to give us the right to vote. So you're afraid of a few people heckling or a few people saying words when people died to give you that right? You owe it to them that died for us to make sure that we take a little discomfort and cast our vote. Because if we don't, we're going to end up with them back in charge. And you think you're intimidated now, you're going to live a life of intimidation where your children will not be educated right, you will not be able to sustain a job and a high position and live in a certain neighborhood. You will usher in a whole lifestyle change of being intimidated rather than just one day.
Rev, thank you so much for coming on the record again. Our next conversation after the election, I want to talk about what happens after that. We have conversation before the election, but there's a real conversation that also needs to happen immediately following.
Well, believe me, I'll be watching the election and I'll be ready to go on the record.
Thank you so much, Rev. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. God bless.